During one-year tours in Vietnam, over 70% of PBR sailors would be either killed or wounded. They were the most frequently ambushed unit in the entire Vietnam War and had one of the most important jobs, yet they remained almost completely overlooked for some reason. Today we're going to correct that and tell you the story of the river rats, who patrolled the most hostile waters in the world. When the United States entered the Vietnam War, besides jungles and rice paddies, they faced a front they hadn't seen since the Civil War, the Mekong Delta. It's a vast network of more than 1,400 miles of natural rivers and about 2,400 miles of man-made canals. Now you might wonder why they made those canals and why they were so important for both the Americans and the North Vietnamese guerrillas. Well, that's because the ground roads there were scarce and often impassable, yet 8 million people lived in towns and villages throughout the Mekong Delta. So, logically, using boats, those waterways became the main roads for movement and supply. Viet Cong guerrillas were, of course, quick to use this to smuggle men and tons of weapons and supplies into South Vietnam, allowing them to control territory, which was especially effective since the Americans in the beginning didn't have a way to control such terrain. They could easily hide in dense mangrove swamps where the deep draft warships America had were useless. South Vietnam had small navy boats to patrol such terrain, but they were stretched thin and mostly used for other purposes than patrolling for smugglers. It was also quite dangerous to do so, as they were easy to ambush while floating on the water without any protection, and attackers could hide anywhere along the coast. Remember this information because it will be important when the Americans come in with their boats. American advisors saw this problem and knew that in order to disrupt the North Vietnamese forces' ability to fight, they had to strangle this supply artery through those shallow rivers. Then something bizarre happened that really showed just how important these brown waters were for enemy supply, the so-called Vung Ro Bay incident. An American medevac helicopter was flying along the coast when the pilot spotted an old naval trawler camouflaged with trees and bushes with something going on around it. The pilot reported this strange sighting, and it was soon realized that no friendly vessels were operating there. South Vietnamese A-1 Sky Raiders were quickly dispatched to attack it, which they did, and the vessel was sunk. The next day, additional airstrikes were conducted, and Vietnamese commandos stormed the coast to investigate. They came under machine gun fire from hidden concrete bunkers that they had to clear with shotguns, and after surprisingly heavy resistance, they finally saw what the guerrillas were so desperately trying to hide and defend once they were discovered. On the sunken ship and unloaded along the coast lay about 100 tons of Chinese and Soviet-made war material, including around 4,000 rifles and submachine guns, 1,500 grenades, and many mortar rounds and explosives. This was serious weaponry that could cause a lot of problems for South Vietnamese and American units, and they realized that these brown waters had to be put under control as soon as possible. But the Viet Cong wouldn't give up easily either. Now the US command needed to organize a force for this job, so very soon Operation Game Warden was launched and Task Force 116 was formed in December 1965, marking the creation of the US Brown Water Navy. Funny enough, this was the first time since the American Civil War that US sailors would routinely operate on rivers. They would work alongside their South Vietnamese allies and patrol these regions for any suspicious activity, which would soon turn out to be a very dangerous job, as you're about to see. The first problem was that they needed to find something that could move through these muddy, shallow, weedy waters, and they didn't have anything suitable for that. They experimented with different boats until someone got the idea to try out a small 31-foot fiberglass pleasure craft that the Uniflight company was producing. What was special about them was that they had a shallow, flat bottom that drew less than a foot of water. That fiberglass hull was light and flexible, although it offered no protection against enemy fire. But you'll hear more about that in a moment. Most importantly, instead of propellers that would get tangled in weeds, these boats were powered by twin diesel engines, driving water jet pumps that sucked in river water and expelled it through nozzles at high speed, a system known as water jet propulsion. These could push up to 6,000 gallons of water a minute and propel the 9-ton boat to about 30 knots, allowing it to skim over mudflats or even jump over sandbars. It could steer by swiveling the jet nozzles left or right to redirect the thrust, which gave it great maneuverability. The whole boat could spin within its own length and make tight turns to chase or evade enemies. It got the name PBR, short for Patrol Boat River. They finally had the right tool to do the job, and speed was vital because it would be the only form of protection for the crews who were about to become some of the most ambushed units in the entire war. They would become known by names like River Rats or Brownwater Black Berets. So now, before we go into combat itself, let's first tell you how these boats looked and why the enemy feared them, and subsequently tried their best to destroy them. Each boat was crewed by just 4 sailors, each one with several specific roles. The boat captain was stationed at the helm, steered the boat, handled navigation, and ran the radio. In front of him was the forward gunner, and at the stern was the aft gunner, who doubled as the engineer, making sure the engines and water jets worked properly. The 4th member helped anyone on the boat when needed, from loading the weapons and helping the captain with the radio to watching the coast with searchlights or the small radar they had for night operations. Because the boat was made almost entirely from fiberglass, bullets would go straight through it. There were instances of RPGs passing through the boat without detonating if the engine or something hard was hit that would activate the warhead. There was some armor around key components and crew positions, but it offered more feeling of protection than actual protection. The crew knew that if they wanted to stay alive, they had to use 2 things to their advantage, and that was speed and overwhelming firepower. Which brings us to the armament. The forward gunner usually had twin 50 caliber machine guns, and at the rear there was another single 50 or 30 caliber machine gun. Then there was also an additional M60 and a Mark 18 automatic grenade launcher. There was also standard personal armament, M16 rifles, M79 grenade launchers, shotguns, and sometimes even mortars or light rocket launchers. The configuration of weapons varied from boat to boat, but crews usually tried their best to arm themselves as heavily as possible because the water they were operating in was anything but a safe place to be. So now, the Task Force 116 was ordered to patrol day and night to seize the Delta's waterways from the Viet Cong and prevent them from supplying weapons. But the Viet Cong, although having nowhere near the high speed and heavy armament of the Americans, were actually masters of the Delta. They knew the terrain like the back of their pocket, and they weren't afraid to make daring ambushes to destroy those PBRs harassing them. Life on the PBR quickly became unpredictable. Either you were bored with nothing going on, but with the possibility to get very exciting at any given moment, after which you'd probably wish you were bored again. They worked between 12 and 16-hour shifts, and everyday life on a boat was not a comfortable experience. Just imagine this. You are constantly on the water near an incredibly loud engine whose fumes you are inhaling, causing headaches and vomiting. The hot, humid season would change to monsoon rains, which were also not fun. Mosquitoes and heat do not go well with your outfit of helmet, boots, and flak jacket. You have only your fighting position, no bunk, no toilet, and as a nice bonus, an enemy that might be in any bush along the coastline, needing only one good burst or RPG hit to make you another one of the roughly 70% of PBR crews that were sent home either in metal caskets or severely wounded. So, how did a typical patrol on the river look? During the day, boats usually worked in pairs, with one stopping and inspecting sampans and junks, which were mostly local people going about everyday business, carrying goods to sell at the local market or something, while the second one watched the coastline and stood ready to unleash heavy firepower if anything shady happened. Every now and then, they would stop an ordinary-looking sampan with an ordinary-looking villager on it, except that instead of rice, there were weapons, explosives, or supplies for the Viet Cong. It might be a Viet Cong fighter who wouldn't give up so easily or had his small boat booby-trapped, but a lot of times they were indeed ordinary local villagers who were forced to smuggle supplies for the Viet Cong, with their families in danger if they refused. Even women and children were used as cover to smuggle weapons. The local population was often terrorized by the Viet Cong, and most of the time didn't have much of a choice about whether they'd help them or not. These blurred lines made everything even more difficult, as the soldiers never knew what to expect. PBR crews would then detain the person and seize the cargo they were carrying, and in doing this they actually stopped tons and tons of war material that would be used against American and South Vietnamese troops. They would fire a warning burst in front of the boat they wanted to stop if it wasn't listening to commands, and if it refused to stop, it would get destroyed by heavy machine gun fire or grenade launchers. Quite a few went this way. However, the trouble usually came from the shore. The terrain offered countless ideal spots for ambushes, so river rats tried to deny this cover to the enemy by setting vegetation on fire with flamethrowers or even flaming arrows. During the night, however, patrols looked different because between 200 hours and 600 hours, anyone moving was presumed hostile and probably an enemy. Boat crews used starlight scopes, radars, or fired flares to help them identify what was moving around. It was a mentally wrecking job because they had to be constantly on the lookout, move fast, and immediately respond with all their weapons. The Viet Cong could also lay mines and booby traps specifically for PBRs, and they were often targeted by RPGs or recoilless rifles hidden along the coast. During the day, if engaged in a firefight, the boat would maneuver around and open fire with all its weapons, and there were always UH-1B Hueys, the so-called Seawolf Hueys, on standby. These were armed with machine guns, miniguns, and rocket pods, and they would fly in to support the boats in a firefight or to rescue damaged ones. PBRs also worked closely with the SEAL teams. If they discovered a suspected enemy camp or cache, they would insert the SEAL commandos under the cover of darkness to destroy it, or for other missions like long-range reconnaissance or setting up ambushes for guerrillas. A single PBR unit logged about 70,000 patrol hours per month on average and engaged in around 80 firefights. So you now see how intense their job was. They had about a 6% casualty rate per month, so the chances that your year-long tour would go without a scratch were slim. However, crews took pride in their work and were considered an elite unit. Although most of the River War was made of smaller engagements and firefights, there were several full-on battles and incidents that stood out for their intensity. For example, on October 31st, 1966, 2 PBRs engaged in a 3-hour battle against multiple enemy boats and shore positions. They ran into what was described as a beehive of enemy activity, but instead of fleeing under attack, the boats aggressively charged forward, opening up with all the firepower they had. They wanted to break contact and wait for air support, but then ran into an even stronger enemy force. With no other choice, they attacked head-on, maneuvering and laying down heavy fire. After about half an hour, the Seawolf Hueys arrived, and together with the 2 boats inflicted heavy losses and damage on the enemy. It was the longest naval engagement of the war, lasting well into the night, and by the end, around 50 enemy boats were sunk and over 100 guerrilla fighters killed. Boatswain's Mate First Class James E. Williams, who led the 2 boats, received the Medal of Honor for his leadership that day, and also earned the Navy Cross, Silver Star, and many other awards for his other acts of heroism in incredibly risky fights. But James wasn't the only one. Task Force 116 earned a staggering array of medals, which is even more impressive when you consider how small they were, with only about 400 boats operating throughout the war. Another Medal of Honor was tragically earned a couple of months later. Seaman David G. Uele was manning the forward gun on his PBR when suspicious activity was observed along the riverbank. They made a high-speed pass along the bank to see what was going on when an enemy grenade landed on the boat. 22-year-old David saw the grenade land, jumped from his forward gun position, pushed the exposed captain down the hatch, and threw himself between the grenade and the rest of the crew, just as it exploded. David was killed by the blast, but his body absorbed most of the shrapnel and saved the rest of the crew. He was posthumously awarded the Medal of Honor. So you see just how unpredictable their job was and how battles could take any shape or form. You'd never know. During the Tet Offensive, PBRs provided mobile fire support and ferried reinforcements, helping the infantry under onslaught until larger forces could arrive, playing a huge part in preventing a complete collapse under the massive North Vietnamese offensive. By 1970, under the Vietnamization policy, Americans were slowly turning brown water duty over to the South Vietnamese, and Task Force 116 was soon disbanded when Operation Game Warden officially concluded. As you know, by 1975, the South Vietnamese government collapsed without direct American support, and most of the PBRs that had been left to the South Vietnamese were either destroyed or fell into enemy hands. This basically added insult to injury, making it seem like all that work and sacrifice had been pointless. PBR crews were mostly overshadowed by other events of the Vietnam War and never got anywhere near the recognition they deserved. So, this short video is my attempt to correct that and tell you their story.